Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of favorite EPs, and as I spoke about on Monday, I expected more of these, and we're 2 for 3 right now. An EP that is just one song. Today we're going to be looking at the Decemberists' The Tain. This is set up in 5 parts or 5 movements. We're looking at about 18 and a half minutes of music ahead of us. Let's dive into it and see what the Decemberists are bringing to the table today.
Here upon this pillow made of reed and willow, you're a fickle little twister. Are you sweet on your sister? Your fallow won't leave you alone.
Alright, this is starting off really well.
And granted for their pleasure, possessions laid to measure. She's a salty little pisser with the cock in her kisser, but now she's a will of her own.
The organ is a really great choice on top of the guitar tone here. All that tension of the dissonance baked into the organ.
Damn your ankles and eyes wide, from your fingernails to your ponytails too. King of the insects and the M5 of the Charlemagne in a motorcade too.
I have a bit of a tough time placing the year on this. It certainly has a lot of the bluesy aspects of early rock and roll, but it also kind of has some vibes of the 90s in there as well. Smashing Pumpkins, I think, is the specific 90s sound I get from this.
Now all the marchers descend from high. I will dedicate all of my awakenings to this. fries. Baby needs a new and shiny fries. In this place called Heavenly, you were born here.
This build-up is really well done. It's interesting, I've been following along with the placement of the movements. We're in movement 3 right now. They're almost individual songs, aside from the transitions being smooth between them. I think they work standalone as well.
Saddle dust in your hair to watch you shake, shout it out with our armaments bare. We shed our
And this one is also in 3.
travel on. From the lee of the wall, he comes in chariot, and all his eunuchs and thralls can scarce lift his line and lariat. Here come loose the hound to blow me down. On this stretch of ground,
Really interesting for this third movement to completely ditch a lot of the bluesy elements. Well, I should say the prevalent bluesy elements from the first 2 movements.
to sleep.
I love that bass tone here as well. It sounds really nice, acting as the warmth underneath all this treble work.
On this stretch of ground, I'll lay me down to sleep.
Now we're in fourth movement. Drastic change there. That is the least smooth transition we've had all song.
Oh, the wind is blowing, it hurts your skin as you climb up hillsides.
Also, still in the waltz feel, our 3/4.
Full of lullabies, orchids and wine. Your memories wrapped within paper and twine. The room that
This is kind of reminiscent of part 1.
is dusty and hard. Sleeping soft babies on piles of yards of gingham, taffeta, cotton and silk. Your dry, hungry mouths cry for your mother's milk.
Oh, I was not expecting the instrument. Really interesting juxtaposing this very folk style with our carnivalesque B section. The brightness, the joy, the entertainment versus this melancholy. Really prominent snare too. How did I miss this last time? And we fade out with these marching snares, pulling us into our fifth and final movement.
Darling dear, what has have you done? Your clothes are torn, your makeup runs.
And we're back to the rock and roll bluesy feeling from movements 1 and 2.
I ran through brambles, blooming thistle. I washed my face in the river when you whistled me on. Darling dear, what have you done? Your hands and face are smeared with blood. The chaplain came and called me out to beat and to butcher his mother's sow.
Such a rock and roll idea. I mean, it's also very bluesy too.
But darling dear,
I don't understand
they
the
found
bar of
him
silence
dead
though.
this morning on the riverbed.
Really nice movement into this idea.
But hush now, darling, don't you cry. Your rewards in the sweet by and by. So hush now, baby, don't you cry. Your rewards in the sweet by and
Finally bringing us back in whole. So, I don't know if it's me, that sounded like an upright bass, which is very cool.
Softly stretch the hours. You're a fickle little twister. Are you sweet on your sister? 'Cause now you go wandering home.
Alright. Yeah, I mean, as usual with these longer tracks, it's going to be more surface level as there's more to dig into, more to remember. My first listen abilities get stretched a bit thin with stuff like this, but there are some interesting things I picked up on it. First of all, there is a very bluesy folk rock and roll thing going on here. The bluesy aspect comes through in a lot of the chord progressions, but not all of them. We also have the organ here, which is very rock and roll, and well, even the upright bass kind of brings a bluesy aspect to it instead of using an electric bass like you would expect in a rock and roll band. Um, it really is that sort of 60s rock sound throughout a lot of this, but not all of it, which I think is the interesting part. We certainly have it in movements 1 and 2. We see a little bit of it near the end of 4, I think, and 5 showcases it, but 3 went in a more modern rock ballad direction, and movement 4 primarily stuck with a variation on that same line we just heard at the end of 5 that presented itself through most of part 1. But we heard it with a different vocalist this time and different instrumentation under it rather than that really twangy acoustic guitar. We had the cello, I think, or the upright bass, one of the two, um, pairing it with the female vocals rather than the male. But it was juxtaposed with organ driven carnival music that eventually sort of evolved into circus music. Parts 3 and 4 stand out from the rest quite heavily, and I think it's interesting that part 1 and 2 move into part 3. They have this natural flow of both ideas, identity, and transition. 2 into 3, we shift the musical identity a little bit, and 3 into 4 leads us into the first harsh transition, where the ending of part 3 and the beginning of part 4 just don't mesh at all. We have a this is what we were doing and this is what we are doing now idea. And 4 to 5 is transitioned through silence, which I think is very neat. The idea is that marching snare, just like 2 hits or something like that, and then 2 beats of silence or something. And the silence is where I think we cross over from the tracks, from track 4 to track 5. And so it is a bit of an abrupt transition, but it fits. It is a smooth transition through the silence. I find it more interesting than that despite the lack of cohesion in sonic identity in tracks 3 and 4 compared to the other three, that it all still kind of fits together in a way that feels cohesive. Harsh transitions, instrumental changes, timbre shifts, and even genre changes aside, I feel like it all feels like one singular story. And if nothing else, the complete tonal shift in part 4 is easily attributed to a perspective change as we get a different vocalist there. The shift to the ballad of part 3, I think, is the most jarring of the entire album, and I'm not sure what to think of it yet, but it is a smooth transition into it, and I give them huge props for getting into that sound without really noticing that we got into it until we had been in the song for a section and a half, and I was like, oh, wait a second, this doesn't have those same bluesy hard rock vibes that we had in parts 1 and 2. Like I said, give some props for that. And that might be part of what keeps it cohesive. The time signature, maybe key. Uh, I don't know. That's definitely something that I would explore on a second listen, is trying to figure out where the cohesion comes from, since it's certainly not the sonic identity. Many of these songs feel like they all belong together, but not all of them do. I began documenting the structure of these tracks because we kick off the first song in a very folk style, A B A B, sort of minimalistic A, Our B is a bit more energetic, a bit more explosive, but the idea still seems to place the emphasis on the vocals to tell a story. Everything else is sort of fundamental. Even the guitar riffs, which can be melodic, tend to just be really cool riffs. They're not really adding to the musical story in a way that I picked up on a first time listen, at least. A lot of the guitar riffs in here, at least to my ears, just tend to be riffs. They're ways for the guitar to fill space and sound pretty cool while doing it, while pushing forward, at least in most of the tracks, a bit of a bluesy edge. What I came away with on this structure, though, after seeing the folk style ABAB of our first section, was not really that interesting. But I do want to point to a couple of things here. Our second movement follows a recent pattern, which I think this came out in 05, so definitely before this structure began to take a hold on popular music. The ABABC, ending your song on the bridge. We followed the same thing we had. Verse, chorus. We have a bridge now to take us out. That bridge takes us into our third track, which is ABABCB. This is our first full traditional cookie cutter structure here. It's also the longest track. Let me check this. I think it's the longest one. Yep. Part 3 is our 5-minute song. It's our ballad. But I think what's most interesting here is we start with the ABAB. Then we tack on a C. Then we tack on a B after that C. And that gives us our structure. It's all built on where we came from, adding one extra piece. The pattern ends here. But I think it's interesting that the pattern also ends at our first hard break. It is the first time that we see a stark contrast between the track we were just listening to and the track we're going into now. The transition between 3 and 4 makes a really rigid shift from the riff at the end of 3 to the beginning of 4, which picks up on a repetition of, or sorry, a variation that we saw in part 1. It almost feels like a reset in some ways, but there's a lot of changes here in the variation that I think presents itself because of this perspective change, possibly. When we get into the lyrics, we'll dive into some of that, but I don't think it is a coincidence that we have a vocalist change and that when we revisit this same concept from part 1, everything is given to a new instrument. Here, though, we go back to our A, B, A, B. The big difference is rather than a bluesy style hard rock song that goes from a more muted, folky style A into an explosive rocking B, we have the isolated A that we sort of had just with upright bass or cello this time into an extended instrumental section of circus and carnival music. From here, we move on to part 5, and it completely upends all the structure. This is just AAB variation on part 1. We're just going to pull a section from a totally different track here. I thought it was kind of cool seeing some parallels. Once we get up there, though, into our final 2 tracks, kind of destroys all the patterns, and even after part 4, when I thought I could find a pattern and work it in, part 5 just nukes the whole thing, and it is, I don't know. Is there really much of a pattern if you just have A's and B's? A lot of songs are built on verses and choruses. There's nothing special here. But what I did find interesting after mapping this out, not so much about any parallels between the structure, which I still think there might be something there if I mapped it out differently. Maybe looking specifically at variation. Again, something to do on a second, third listen. is how each of these tracks can be separated out. I mentioned at the beginning, I think, oh, we might have been halfway through. We might have been going into track 3. And I said, so far, we can look at each of these tracks in standalone. I still think that's true. I don't think track 5 is going to be very good on its own. The same goes for track 1, which is only 2 minutes long. Although it does have a nice sound, I do feel it's a bit too short to be felt as a work of art on its own. And track 5 is certainly, musically, it has so many callbacks. I don't think it stands too well on its own. It's fine, but it's certainly better listened to with the rest of them. 2, 3, and 4 all would be fine on their own. On their own. They're certainly better understood and felt in tandem with the tracks around them. But I think that if somebody said, hey, check out part 3 of the Tain, and I didn't know any of the rest, I think I'd still end up with a pretty good reaction to it. And it makes me wonder why they're run together at all. Especially with that harsh stop between 3 and 4, and technically transitioning on silence from 4 to 5. But the overall idea here, I do believe, is that there's a story connecting all of these, and while musically there are some differentiations, lyrically we're going to hear interconnectivity through all 5. I'm a real big fan of this sound, though. I don't know what it is about bluesy hard rock with like Smashing Pumpkins style 90s idea. I don't even know where the Smashing Pumpkins thing comes from. There is something in here that feels very 90s. I don't know if it's the production. I don't know if it's the separation of the instruments. It could be on the production side. I honestly have no idea. But while there's so much influence from 60s and 70s rock in here and blues, this feels so much like a 90s album to me. And it's not. You know, we already looked this up. It's 2005. But there's something about those super fuzzy guitars, the upright bass, which is just there's nothing to say there's something about upright bass just sounds great no matter what context you're in. Um and the consistency of the waltz. I'm a huge fan of 3/4. I think it's a fantastic time signature. It has flow, but it's not symmetrical. It's one of the few that really work in that capacity. And I think the waltz with the overarching melancholy in most of this works very well. Also, the waltz is a dancey time signature, and the waltz song itself, if you're going to write a waltz, a traditional waltz, it's going to be a bit bouncy and uplifting. It's meant to be danced to. But I think that clash here, they're still emphasizing the downbeat of 1 with a lower instrument and allowing beats 2 and 3 to be emphasized with higher range instruments. They're following the pulse of the waltz to a T, which paired with the dreariness and just the bleak sound of this entire album, it's an interesting combination that evokes imagery that I don't know that I have words to describe. It is this interesting meeting point of sorrow and happiness. There's energy in here. It's very electric at times, featuring an eclectic style of forward momentum that feels both angry and saddened. And I think having the energy of the waltz and the boom 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 boom, sort of that bounciness of it mixed with the overall dreariness that's presented throughout, it might encapsulate some of the emotions that they're specifically aiming for, this energetic sorrow. It makes no sense when you say it like that. It feels like an oxymoron. But I do think they capture it in the time signature and the feel of the waltz presented in this way. I don't know how I got on this topic, but I know I started out by talking about things I enjoyed about this sound, and I do. There's something about 90s rock that's always going to work with me, and I don't know if it's specific production or anything. Like I said, I don't know where it comes from, but I can feel it somewhere in here, and especially track 3, I think, feels very much like a 90s ballad for hard rock. I enjoy the timbre of the vocals. I enjoy the chord progressions we go through. I even would say I enjoyed the organ throughout, which it's not usually a sound that I like. I'm a fan of organs in general, but not this specific organ. It almost feels cheesy given its overuse in the 70s. Um, I might be a little off on that era, but it was used a lot in a very specific kind of rock and roll. And even I'd say it's a stereotypical organ sound for churches a while ago when they were transitioning into electric organs. It just feels cheesy due to the overabundance of it. But it actually ends up working here for some reason. I don't know why. The cheesiness feels more sincere and it brings about an additional element of blues through its texture. It has a bite, it has a grit, and it's often used with dissonance to lean more into that gritty bite that plays off well against the heavy, distorted, destroyed guitar tone that we have in here as well. It's just an interesting. Oh, I'm not gonna say interesting. I'm gonna reuse eclectic. All the sounds in here certainly feel like they mingle as far as eras and usage. We've heard these combinations before, but there's something about maybe the specific timbres, maybe the specific tones or the production on them that make them feel like a ragtag band of instruments that have come together to tell me this tale in a way that almost feels not like they're emulating anything, but it's just the way things happened. As if this guitar and this organ and this vocalist and this upright bass just happened to meet one day and these were the voices that they had and they made a band together. More so than people specifically picking these sounds out. I don't know. Everything about this kind of tells me that it shouldn't have worked as well as it did, but the end result is I enjoyed my time with it quite a bit. I'm going to dig into some lyrics, see what's going on there, and then we're going to wrap this up. So, this is neat. The lyrics are actually based upon an Irish mythology, referred to commonly as the Tain or Tainbo Qualinage. Nope, that is a terrible pronunciation. I can't find any audio pronunciation of this. But I don't know, I can't pronounce it. That's the thing. It translates out to the cattle raid of Cooley, though. It's an epic from Irish mythology, and this album covers 5 main aspects of it, generally summing up the entire story from what I understand, but of course being quite condensed down. Um, Each part is a different aspect of the epic. There are a ton of characters in here, all voiced by the same people. There's a crone, a husband, a captain, a soldier, a chaplain. We have the widow, who is our female vocalist in part 4, and then a woman and daughters in part 5, who are interestingly all voiced by the male vocalist, if I remember correctly, part 5 there. Every other time it seems that the male vocalist voices captains, husbands, characters who, especially at the time that this was written, would have traditionally been male characters. And the one time that we have a shift to a most likely female character, we shift the vocals as well. So it's really interesting that we have the woman and daughter in part 4 speaking to each other, all voiced by the male vocalist. Curious what goes on in that decision. And then we end with the repetition, the variation on our first part. Sung again by the same character, the crone. I'm not going to go into details of each of these parts. I don't really understand the story just through the lyrics themselves. It might help if I had an understanding of the epic itself. But the one part I did want to take a look at was part 4, given the juxtaposition of the dreary, melancholic vocals we have juxtaposed with the juxtaposition of the juxtaposing of the brighter carnivalesque music. And the song is about how cold the wind is these days. Memories wrapped up in paper and twine, and sleeping babies who have dry, hungry mouths. I don't know. I feel like there's so much more context I need to fully understand and fully appreciate what this album is doing. That's going to require multiple listens and probably even checking out this Irish epic, seeing what's going on in there so I can get the larger story and then coming back to the album. As it stands, I enjoyed the sounds of this album, but I'm walking away from this one with not a very strong understanding of what's going on here. But as with most of the stuff that we've checked out from the Decemberists, I've quite enjoyed what they're doing here. I think it's interesting. They have a sound that works for me, and they're writing things most bands wouldn't. So I dig their side of indie rock, I think. I'm pretty sure the last time we checked out the Decemberists, it wasn't bluesy hard rock. So it's very interesting to hear how they change up their sounds for whatever project they're working on. Those are my thoughts on the Decemberists, the Tain, which I don't think I'm pronouncing right anymore. If anyone wants to hit me up with that, let me know. Because, like I said, Google Translate wouldn't give me an audio pronunciation. Wikipedia doesn't have an audio pronunciation of it. And phonetic pronunciations, they only go so far for me. Let me know what you thought of this. If you have your own opinions, perspectives, ideas, different readings of it, if you want to help me understand it, any of that, let me know down in the comment section. Above that, in the description box, you can find a link to Linktree in there. Takes you to this menu. You can find my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all 3 of those. I guess I pushed the wrong button there. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.